Oh, look at me. I'm colored now. Wait, that sounded wrong. One of the mistakes that a lot of aspiring writers make, and a mistake that it took a long time for me to realize I was making, was the idea that the thing that is most important to what they write is the story. It seems logical, it seems perfectly logical. You write something, if people read it, it must be because they like the story. But in real life, things aren't all that logical. I want you to try something out for a moment for me. Imagine to yourself how you would explain Star Wars to someone else. Someone who never ever saw any of the movies. How would you explain the first original Star Wars movie? The one that we now call A New Hope. The one that started it all. How would you explain that movie? Odds are you would explain that there's this, well, it's not in the future, it is in the past according to Star Wars itself, but a futuristic galaxy somewhere where they fly in spaceships and there's something called the Force and they fight with lightsabers and there are the Jedi's that are the good ones and there are the Sith that are the evil ones and they can do all kinds of tricks with the Force. They can read minds, they can jump really high and stuff like that. But if you really think about it, what happens in that movie? What happens in the original Star Wars movie, and how much of a role does the Force really play? When you really look at it, it doesn't play that big a role. It's a background concept. Yeah, Obi-Wan disappears when Darth Vader strikes him down, but does that really matter? Does it matter for the story? No. Yeah, in the end, Luke uses the Force instead of his targeting computer to hit the bullseye. But does that really matter? I'd argue no. I'd actually argue that for the purpose of the story, in the original Star Wars movie, the Force doesn't matter at all. But it's a cool idea, and people attach themselves more to cool ideas than to something they have to think extensively about, and you have to think extensively about a story. Think of the movie Reservoir Dogs, and I know I use movies here, but that's because it's easier to use movies than books because it's easier to get everyone on, ironically, on the same page. If you've ever seen the movie Reservoir Dogs, if you're young, maybe you haven't. It's a pretty violent movie. It's the movie that made Quentin Tarantino a household name. That movie has a lot of memes going for it. There are a lot of images that people remember. There are a lot of bits and pieces people remember. But the actual story, that's not really the central thing in it. The way it's acted out is. In Star Wars, it's the universe that's the big draw. It's a fantastic, fascinating universe of a melting of fantasy, princesses, sword fights, lightsaber fights, or lightsaber duels as they're apparently called, merged with spaceships and aliens and planets and intergalactic, well, interplanetary at least, empires. And in Reservoir Dogs, it's style, it's attitude, it's the visuals of it all, and it's the very mangled storytelling that it uses where it jumps around instead of just going from the beginning to the end. And most movies that are cheered, whether by critics or by the audience or by both, most of the movies, the story really doesn't matter that much. The story is there to give a platform to build upon, a platform where you can show off interesting ideas, interesting worlds, interesting characters. The story just needs to be there. Or in some cases it doesn't. If your characters and your world are good enough, sometimes you don't even need the story. I'm not arguing that you should write as if it was an atlas, but there are plenty of stories that don't really center around a story. They center around a world, or even a person or a group of persons, and how they interact with each other. The story just slips into the background. Now, the fact that story doesn't really matter as much as people think opens a lot of doors. It opens up a lot of possibilities and a lot of questions that you should really ask yourself when writing. Question number one: if story isn't that important, why are so many people talking about structure? More specifically, story structure. What's with this 3-act structure? What's with the 5-act structure? The 3-act structure is a really big thing. It's one of those that you can find tons of videos on, both for movies and books, and I think even for computer games, online or in bookstores or wherever. It's a really big thing. The whole idea of the story has to start with depicting the world, and then I don't remember the 2-act structure. I've gone so far away from it. What is it again? No, you start with a world and a problem, and your character needs to go through a lot of things until the problem can be solved. That's a rough basic on it. Don't really hang me out on that one. I've At this point I've more or less forgotten it. One of the big structures that people also talk about is the monomyth, or the hero's journey. That's the one that you see in movies like Star Wars, for example, and in a lot of the current slew of Disney-based movies. That means also Marvel's and Lucasfilm and Pixar and so on. I'm not going to go into details on it. It's basically about the hero starting out in a world that he or she feels a little aside from, not really fitting into, and then witnessing another world, and then having to go through a lot of things before coming back to the original world. It's a very interesting study. It's a very interesting structure, and it's really good for making stories. I'm not saying any of these are bad for making stories. What I'm saying is they're tools. You don't need to use them. You use them if they feel like they benefit you. Especially the 3-act structure, I have a weird relationship with, because if you really boil it down to its core, then the idea of it is that things start, something happens, and then things end. And that's basically just how time works, which is probably why you can put the 3-act structure on anything you see. Any book you can analyze through the eyes of the 3-act structure, any movie, probably most video games, although video game stories tend to be a little more out there than books or movies because you're interacting with them. But we're focusing on books. But for as much as people keep talking about this, it is a tool. Use it if it makes sense. If it does not make sense, do not use it. Maybe your story isn't about the story. Maybe your story is just a way to portray worlds, to portray characters, to portray ideas, to send a message. If you're a fan of, or at least know a lot about, post-apocalyptic stories, you know that a lot of them have their roots in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union and the United States were pointing tons of nuclear missiles at each other, and everybody was afraid that we'd have a World War III, and that it would be nuclear, and that everything would be destroyed. Because of that, a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction isn't really about a story. It's about depicting the consequences of this war, because what the writer was thinking was, I don't want this war to happen. I want to convey the idea that this would be a horrible thing to happen. So a lot of them are just guided tours through the world with some story slapped in just to keep it all stringed together. Use story structure if you think you need it, but do not fear that what you write is worthless just because you're not adhering to some kind of structure. I could probably continue with other things that change wildly once you start looking at writing as not just writing a plot. Plots are easy. A group of people need to go there to find that. A group of people are attacked and need to defend themselves. A group of people want to attack another group of people. Plots are pretty easy to make, but to write them interestingly, the execution of it, that is quite often the greater task. And the fact that these stories, these plots, are not all that matters, not even the thing that matters the most, can mean both good and bad things. One thing that you might argue is bad is that no matter how clever your story is, it's not finished the moment you know the plot. You don't automatically have a good story just because you made a clever story. It needs more. It needs something else, something that attracts people, something that keeps them hooked on the story. And yes, there's something called a hook, but I wasn't really referring to that. It just needs something that draws the reader in. And it can be a ton of things. And that's where it gets good, because that means that even if you're not into writing complicated or clever plots, or if you're not even able to do so, if you're not good at it or don't feel good at it, that doesn't hinder you in writing a good story, because you can execute a simple idea fantastically. You can write 100 stories that are all about a boy meets a girl and goes to a place because they find that they both like the idea of going to the place. That is a ton of young romance stories right there. And you can find tons of other books where you can group them into packages that are just the same plot used over and over again with new decorations. But if you're starting out with writing, I hope this can help you not fret too much about plot and the story itself, and just let you enjoy fleshing out characters, fleshing out worlds, fleshing out situations, fleshing out ideas. A good story, a good plot, does not make for a good read automatically. It still has to be executed right. And a weak plot, a weak story, doesn't mean that what you're writing is going to be bad. A lot of books are loved for things that have nothing to do with the story, for the world, for the characters, the situation, for single ideas. So with that, have a good one and have a good writing. I'm still looking for something clever to say at the end, yes.